Okay. Okay. So this week we're talking about physical activity, fitness, and all-cause mortality. So first, I wanted to just briefly mention life expectancy in the US. So you often see that thrown out as sort of a metric of the health of a country is life expectancy at birth. So occasionally you will also see in studies study mentioning life expectancy at age 50, for example. So that obviously changes significantly, and maybe life expectancy at age 50 would be something like 20 years, whereas life expectancy at birth, right, is a little more common, but you can see here that's, anywhere from 70s to 90s-ish. So what you see here is also a list of sort of the countries with the highest GDP in the world, and that often sort of correlates with life expectancy. And this is 2017 data, so it's a little bit old, but it hasn't changed significantly since then. So you see that the country average displayed here is 82.3, and then the US, I can't even see my own screen, is down at 78.6. So relative to other countries who have sort of high socioeconomic status, we have a relatively low life expectancy here. What's a little bit ironic about that is that our healthcare spending per capita is significantly higher than most other countries. And I certainly have some critiques for the healthcare system in the United States. However, in looking at something like this, I think it's also helpful to mention things like what we talked about last week, which was a lot of different organizations that fund a lot of research in the United States. So the United States, along with probably China, is the next biggest producer of research, but the United States produces a lot of research that then impacts the health and well-being of other high income countries. So although I don't think this number is really reflective of direct sort of consumer healthcare spending, it is still significant enough that we should probably consider revising our healthcare expenditures in order to better align that with life expectancy. I also think that one thing that's sort of not shown here, right, is quality of life. And often when you look at quality of life, just for the record, you see them pretty similar. The United States isn't ranked particularly high compared to other high-income countries. So just for the record. Okay, and then so what's killing people, right? This list of diseases also doesn't actually fluctuate all that much. So heart disease and cancer have been at the top of the list for, I don't know, the last 10, 20 years. So really chronic diseases. We're not looking at infectious diseases. Then you've got unintentional injuries, and chronic lower respiratory diseases. Stroke is up there, right, which is often talked about in conjunction with heart disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes. Influenza is really the first one that we see that's more of an infectious disease as opposed to a chronic disease. Perhaps, nope, sorry, I was gonna say something else, but I'm gonna skip that. And then kidney diseases. So in any case, and then you've got suicide at the bottom of the list of top 10, right? That's still not insignificant, but relative to heart disease and cancer, it's not killing people in any case at the same rate. So I think I just want you to be aware of where the US sits in relation to other countries, and then also what's doing the killing and what's increasing our mortality rate. And heart disease and cancer are huge contributors. Also, if you pay attention to this, physical activity, sedentary behavior, and sleep all contribute significantly to pretty much this entire list, even something like unintentional injuries. Low sleep, or short sleep rather, is significantly associated with increased injury risk. So really your 24-hour movement patterns are impacting all of these, even something like the flu. There was a really cool study a couple of years ago that infected people with the flu, actually, which is amazing. I mean, flu doesn't typically kill people, particularly in the United States, but it's sort of crazy that they still got that through an ethics review board. In any case, they infected people with influenza, and with one group, they shortened their sleep, and with another group, they were sleeping ad libitum, meaning as much as they wanted to. Um, and the short sleep group actually contracted the disease. So, right, we get exposed to pathogens all the time and we don't necessarily always get sick. But the group that experienced short sleep contracted the flu at a much, much higher rate. I don't remember the exact numbers. Maybe I'll see if I can put my hands on that article for you. But in any case, 24-hour movement patterns are significantly impacting all the diseases that are killing people. And that's sort of what I'm trying to show here as well. So map on the right, green, looking at the prevalence of adults meeting the physical activity recommendations, right? And you see that Colorado and Alaska are the highest states, oh, and DC, with greater than 25% meeting physical activity recommendations. 25% is still relatively low, right? So in the highest states, maybe 1 in 4 people are meeting physical activity recommendations. And in most of the country, you have significantly less than that. So, and some states, even less than 15%, right? So it's pretty low. And that's a little bit old data, 2011. I actually think it's gone down, but I should update this slide. And then you look at mortality per 100,000 people, right? And the only reason I show these two together is that you sort of see similar-ish patterns, right? So we see down in like the southeast area of the country, there's sort of this line from like Louisiana up to West Virginia. And it follows fairly closely the physical activity, the prevalence of meeting physical activity guidelines. So again, just some data suggesting that there's probably some kind of a relationship between these two variables. Okay, so what's the strength of the association between physical activity and mortality? First, we want to look at the difference between the 2008 and the 2018 DHHS PA guidelines. So the Department of Health and Human Services has put out every 10 years recommendations for movement patterns, and sleep is being added to that. So, but the biggest thing that changed between 2008 and 2018 is that light physical activity matters. So pay attention to that in the article that you read for this week. It's pretty interesting to see the lack of it, in my opinion, there, despite the fact that I think that we do have enough evidence to support that light physical activity matters significantly. In any case, there's typically an inverse association. We'll go over what that means a little later in this lecture, I believe. But an inverse association between physical activity volume or fitness or meeting the guidelines with mortality. And you see that across studies, and you'll see that in the research that you read for today as well. The relative risk is if we combine studies, you're looking at something like 0.69, meaning if you're meeting physical activity guidelines, then your risk for mortality, all-cause mortality, meaning any of those causes of death that I presented earlier, right, goes down by 31%. Okay, so that's pretty significant. And that you do actually get more benefit from more physical activity volume or from higher fitness levels. And that holds pretty true across age and sex. However, a lot of the data is from a non-Hispanic white population. There's becoming increasing evidence in other populations as well, in other races and ethnicities. It's just a little slow to come. We generally see the same trend, particularly in Black or African American populations. There does seem to be maybe a slight difference in the effect with a Hispanic population. So if I remember right, particularly a female Hispanic population seems to maybe not get quite as much benefit as other populations. So that's new research relatively. So I don't think that there's enough to really say that definitively, but it's interesting. Okay, I don't expect you to remember all of these studies, but I just want you to know, like, this data isn't coming from a single source. It's coming from a lot of different sources. So we have the US Railroad Worker Study from 1951. The Finnish health study is huge, 1982. Notice those two looking at occupational physical activity, right? As we've as time has gone on, we've seen lower and lower levels of occupational physical activity. So that's partly why you don't see that quite as much anymore. Also because some domain-specific analyses, so we talked about domains last week, right? Occupational, leisure time, transport, and sometimes domestic work are sort of the four most common domains. In any case, you don't see occupational studied as much anymore. It doesn't seem to have as great an effect. But those two studies, right, you did see a significant effect actually. And in the Finnish health study, looking at men and women, and note that they did adjust for several other factors in that Finnish health study, and that's true for the rest of the studies that we look at as well. All that means is that the effect, so the relative risk, is due to a change in physical activity, and it's not due to age, BMI, smoking, diastolic blood pressure, or cholesterol. So we know that age would increase risk for mortality, right? As we get older, we're more likely to die. Okay. So we have to say, okay, we know that's happening. How do I control for that? How do I statistically say, okay, I know that's going to happen. Therefore, I'm eliminating that from my analysis and just isolating it to physical activity levels. So that's all adjusting means. The Harvard Alumni Study we already talked about, 1962, looking at leisure time physical activity, Seventh-day Adventists. This one is a little interesting because they looked at death before 50. So just sort of showing that like it's not, again, just about age, that even in younger populations, you have a much lower risk of dying if you are physically active. Some prospective cohort studies. So looking again at leisure time physical activity, but also the combination of leisure time physical activity with BMI. I'm not going to go too deep into it because I think there are some better studies out there right now. But basically, BMI in that study seems to have a greater impact actually than your leisure time physical activity. Now, when you look at fitness and compare it to BMI, generally fitness is a much stronger predictor as opposed to just physical activity. And I think we'll get into that later. If not, we can get into it in class. And then the last one is the Swedish Twin Registry Study. So I think that one is, in my opinion, it adds the most to the research literature because what we've done, notice all of these are observational studies, right? So I didn't randomize these people. But what's interesting about this is it does take into account the genetic component, right? So we know there's a genetic component to mortality risk as well. Twins, and these were monozygotic twin pairs, right? So they have identical DNA. We know that even if you had identical DNA, your risk for mortality decreases significantly if you are physically active in your leisure time. Okay, so real quick, just want to go over, this is sort of what we think is happening. So a lot of studies look at, here, let me get my laser pointer. Okay, so a lot of studies look at this. They look at physical activity, and we are talking later this week about FIT VP. So these are aspects of our exposure to physical activity. But we assume that physical activity is impacting morbidity and mortality. So if you increase physical activity, you decrease morbidity and mortality. That sort of skips over this middle piece, which is assuming that if we increase physical activity, we increase fitness. And fitness is by far the better predictor. So there may be a little bit more of a disconnect here than is intuitive to think about. We would normally expect, oh, increase physical activity, increase fitness. And it seems like that's not always the case. So fitness is, though, largely determined by physiologic attributes or physiologic responses to recent physical activity. So we can increase or decrease fitness based on our behavior. It's a lot harder to study though. So that's why you don't see it as often. Because with physical activity, right, I could put a tracker on your wrist and tell you how much you've moved. I could also give you a survey and ask how much you've moved, right? With fitness, I have to directly measure it. And so it's a lot more time intensive and you need more expensive equipment to do it. So even if that was just an estimate, you were doing it, let's say via a step test or something, that's still much more expensive and takes a lot more time than giving someone a survey. Also note that muscular fitness is not addressed here at all. This is almost always referring to aerobic fitness. So when you read research studies, be really aware of that, that you cannot necessarily take the findings of aerobic fitness and aerobic physical activity and apply them to resistance exercise, which is done more often than it should be. There is resistance exercise work out there, and we will examine some of that later in the semester, but note that this study, particularly this week, is just about aerobics. CRF, so CRF stands for cardiorespiratory fitness. That's sort of the gold standard, VO2 max. And you typically see a greater association with mortality if you have a VO2 max measurement than you do with smoking and mortality, which is pretty wild. Additionally, sedentary activity is studied pretty often. They do have sedentary behavior and physical activity have independent effects. And I think later in this presentation, or for sure, if not next week, we'll talk about sort of the independent effects of sedentary behavior and physical activity on exercise. Or on mortality. Okay, this is just a look at some at the mechanisms, and I just want to give you some exposure to this multiple times throughout the semester, so you start to get an idea of how is this all working, right? So we've got 24-hour movement patterns that lead to positive energy balance of some kind, typically. That can lead to dyslipidemia, meaning high cholesterol in the blood, triglycerides, etc. And that can lead to adiposopathy, so increased fat storage, and potentially also impaired signaling of fat molecules. Also, adiposopathy would be an indicator of obesity, although take note, obesity is strictly diagnosed by BMI. So that's not technically speaking an indicator of adiposopathy, okay? These two contribute to insulin resistance. Okay, so insulin is a storage molecule. It's really important for us, right? If I'm not responding appropriately to insulin, then I often have problems in my blood vessels as well. So that insulin resistance can lead to atherosclerosis, along with dyslipidemia. So I'm going to have more fat, more sugar in my bloodstream, which can cause damage, which then causes plaque buildup, right? And that's my cardiovascular disease issues, right? So cardiovascular disease, again, take note, it refers to more than just a heart attack, right? It could refer to a stroke. It could refer to an embolism, right? There's lots of things, but plaque in the arteries in any case. And then the insulin resistance, right, is most closely associated with type 2 diabetes. Those risk factors often, right, because they're damaging the blood vessels, often lead to hypertension, right? And they're also pulling, we're forcing the heart to work harder because now the blood's thicker with that fat and with that sugar. And so now the heart has to work a lot harder to pump the blood through the body. So you often see hypertension with that. And with hypertension, we have serious risk of heart failure as well as renal diseases. So end-stage renal disease is a pretty big issue there as well. Okay, so again, brief summary there. It's also helpful to consider environment and identity with this, right? Who are these individuals, right? What are the communities that they live in? And that's something that's not really been studied extensively, but I think we need more research on that. Okay, we're going to take a quick 5-minute break here, and we will come back.